Welcome to the Claire and Horatio Daily World Brief. You can find the full briefing over at claireandhoratio.com. Today is Thursday, August 20th, 2026. And we're starting with a highly scrutinized, really somber development out of the Middle East regarding the actual mechanics of military accountability. So, as of today, the Israeli military has officially confirmed that its troops did fire on the car carrying 5-year-old Hein Rajab back in 2024. And the Israeli Defense Forces have now opened a criminal investigation into her killing, as well as the killing of the 2 Palestinian Red Crescent paramedics who were dispatched to save her.
Yeah, and the timeline of those events, it remains just deeply harrowing. And it points to severe breakdowns in coordination because, the Henry Job actually initially survived the attack that killed 6 of her relatives in that vehicle. She managed to get on the phone with Red Crescent operators, which resulted in this desperate call that lasted for hours. The operators instructed her to hide under the seats while they went through the formal channels to coordinate an ambulance rescue with the Israeli army.
And that coordination piece is what makes the conclusion so chilling, right? Because they followed the protocols.
Right, exactly. After dark, the paramedics, Yusuf Al-Zaino and Alevit Al-Matoun, they notified operators that they were approaching the location. They said they were actively undergoing a check by Israeli forces. And that was the last communication before the line went dead. And it's worth noting the IDF is now also investigating a separate incident. This is from March 23 of last year, 2025, in the Tal al-Sultan area of Rafah. In that case, 15 Palestinians, which included medics and a UN worker, were killed after an IDF unit fired on a convoy that was actively utilizing emergency lights.
We really need to pause and examine the legal architecture of this whole process, though. I mean, when a military investigates its own personnel during an active, ongoing conflict, how much of that is an actual pursuit of justice? Or is it a calculated legal maneuver to just build a shield against the International Criminal Court? Because the Israeli human rights group Yeshi Din provides some crucial data on this specific mechanism. They point out that criminal indictments against soldiers are exceedingly rare. And in the few instances where convictions do actually occur, they routinely result in these disproportionately lenient sentences that bear, really little relation to the severity of the offenses. So it raises the question of whether internal investigations serve to uncover truth or merely to satisfy international legal requirements on paper.
And that tension between, nominal accountability and actual justice, it becomes even more complicated when we widen the scope to look at the sheer scale of the missing right now. The known death toll in Gaza exceeds 73,000, but the Civil Defense Agency estimates that over 8,000 people are currently unaccounted for, which creates this agonizing perpetual limbo for thousands of families. Consider the case of 21-year-old Ahmed Al-Mahoun. He's a young man with Down syndrome who disappeared in May 2025. His family does not know if he's buried under rubble or if he's being held in Israeli detention. There's no official mechanism providing them with answers.
And we also have cases like Mahmoud Al-Drimli, who disappeared back in 2024. I was reading that his mother recently saw a photograph circulating on social media of a blindfolded and bound detainee, and she's certain it's her son. But there's absolutely no way to confirm it because the administrative blackout is near total. I mean, Israeli restrictions prevent the Red Cross from visiting prisons or accessing detention records. And you compound that with a severe lack of DNA testing equipment that's even permitted to enter Gaza. And recovered remains often just, they can't be identified. So families are left relying on, a single blurry photograph to guess if their sons are alive and being held without charge. It's a profound failure of basic humanitarian infrastructure.
Shifting to how broader geopolitical strategies interact with these regional tensions, U.S. policy in the Middle East is moving toward an exceptionally aggressive economic posture right now. The U.S. Treasury Department, led by Secretary Scott Bessent, has announced a campaign that they're calling Operation Economic Fury. It's set to launch in just a few days, on August 24. And Bessent stated the explicit goal is to squash Iran's economy and collapse the regime. He delivered this really stark ultimatum to global allies, saying literally, you are either with us or against us.
Which comes on the heels of a lot of recent military action, right?
Yeah, contextually, this directly follows the U.S. and Israeli strikes we saw in February of this year, the complete breakdown of truces in April and June, and then Iran's subsequent move to close the Strait of Hormuz.
And if you're listening and looking at your own household energy bill this month, realize that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is not just some distant geopolitical maneuvering tactic. That specific waterway handles 20% of the world's oil transit. Shutting it down directly causes wild global price fluctuations, which, instantly filter down into household budgets worldwide. And inside Iran, the civic impact is just devastating. Citizens are currently enduring 60% inflation on basic goods. Food prices have doubled in just 12 months. This policy it's actively pricing people out of their own survival.
Which brings up a critical analytical question regarding the actual efficacy of Besant's strategy. Because Iran has survived severe, crippling sanctions since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the regime has managed to maintain its grip on power primarily by violently suppressing internal dissent, most recently cracking down on massive protests driven by the spiraling cost of living. So, will these new intensified penalties actually achieve the stated goal of toppling the government? Or will they simply deepen the impoverishment and suffering of everyday Iranians while the state machinery just finds alternative, illicit avenues for trade?
And that intentional use of policy to lock in long-term geopolitical realities brings us to a major diplomatic rift right now regarding the occupied West Bank. The UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Canada have issued a joint condemnation of Israel's decision to open tenders for 1,200 new settlement homes in the E1 area.
And the specific geography of E1 is what makes this a flashpoint. This is a roughly 12 square kilometer area, and it sits directly between East Jerusalem and the settlement of Male Adumim. The United Nations actually refers to this development as an existential threat to a future Palestinian state because of how it permanently alters the map. Building settlements in E1 effectively cuts the West Bank in two. It completely isolates East Jerusalem and prevents any contiguous Palestinian urban development connecting Ramallah, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem. And what's equally crucial here is the timeline. The tenders are due on October 19th. That is intentionally timed just days before the Israeli general election.
Right, and that deadline makes it exceptionally difficult for any future coalition government to overturn the development. They're essentially using the calendar to exploit systemic loopholes and cement a physical reality on the ground. And, we're actually witnessing a very similar exploitation of legal loopholes right now within the United States executive branch, where the administration is aggressively wielding executive power to bypass traditional legal frameworks. For instance, 20 deportees recently arrived in Liberia. This is the first wave of a massive Trump administration agreement to send up to 1,200 migrants to the West African nation. And the financial mechanics behind this are staggering. The U.S. pledged $124 million in assistance to Liberia and actually extended visitor visas for Liberian nationals specifically in exchange for their cooperation.
And the operation in Liberia is really merely one visible piece of a much larger, often secret strategy spanning 35 countries. A Senate Foreign Relations Committee report recently revealed the U.S. paid over $32 million to 5 governments to accept third-country deportees. The breakdown of those funds demands a lot of scrutiny. The administration paid $1.1 million per person to send 7 deportees to Rwanda and $7.5 million to Equatorial Guinea for 29 people. Human rights lawyers argue this is a highly calculated legal loophole designed to indirectly force asylum seekers back into danger. By deporting them to countries they have never visited, the administration leaves these individuals with no viable economic or social options, frequently compelling them to return to the home countries they originally fled.
It sounds exactly like geopolitical money laundering. The administration cannot legally or ethically send these vulnerable populations directly back to the active dangers they escaped, so they're paying an astronomical premium to a middleman country to do the dirty work for them. And we're seeing this exact same flavor of executive overreach applied domestically. A federal judge just allowed the highly controversial Sable offshore oil pipeline in California to resume operations. This completely bypasses state environmental regulators who explicitly called the company's actions an egregious trespass on public land.
Yeah, and the mechanism the administration utilized here is the Defense Production Act. They invoked this specific national security tool, citing energy supply disruption risks related to the ongoing conflict with Iran, to wholly preempt California state law. For context, this is a pipeline that was forcibly shut down in 2015 after a catastrophic rupture caused one of California's worst coastal oil spills.
Wait, hold on. The Defense Production Act is traditionally a wartime measure, isn't it? used to compel companies to produce munitions or, more recently, medical supplies during a pandemic. Using it as a domestic override switch to force open a local oil pipeline with a history of catastrophic failure seems like a massive stretch. It turns a localized environmental and safety dispute into a matter of federal defense, effectively stripping the state of its ability to protect its own coastline.
Exactly. It's a complete reinterpretation of executive authority.
Real quick, for more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, visit claraneratio.com. Now, when we look at this aggressive use of executive action on the political right, we also need to examine the political machinery funding these maneuvers, which brings us to the fracturing identity of the political left in the U.S. We're currently witnessing an intense proxy war between progressive and corporate Democrats, which is perfectly illustrated by the recent Michigan primary between progressive Dr. Abdul El-Said and corporate-aligned Haley Stevens.
And the financial arms race in that specific primary was entirely unprecedented for a local race. Outside super PACs spent up to $60 million backing Stevens. That created a 12-to-1 television ad spending advantage against El-Said. To put the sheer volume of that cash into perspective, these groups spent an average of $95 for every single vote cast against El-Said. His campaign, by contrast, spent just $9 per vote. The groups backing Stevens included heavily funded corporate PACs explicitly aiming to suppress El-Said's agenda, which focused heavily on Medicare for All and banning corporate PACing money from elections.
Former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich provides some essential historical context on how the Democratic Party arrived at this point. He points out that the party began heavily courting corporate money in the early 1980s. Figures like Representative Tony Coelho argued that to survive, the party needed to drink from the exact same campaign funding froth as Republicans. They achieved parity in corporate contributions, but Reich argues it was a Faustian bargain that fundamentally shifted the party's entire legislative agenda away from working-class Americans.
The long-term civic and policy consequences of that shift are profoundly visible today. Tethered to corporate funding, the party leadership embraced free trade agreements without providing adequate, binding protections for blue-collar workers. They systematically failed to reform labor laws, which resulted in union membership plummeting from 22% in the 1990s to below 10% today. We also saw the ossification of antitrust enforcement over decades, which allowed massive corporate consolidation. So the core tension in the Democratic Party today is a fundamental battle over identity. Will it return to its working-class roots or remain structurally dependent on the corporate PT money that inherently dictates its current policy limitations?
Moving from the structural stress on American political institutions, we're seeing a different kind of systemic strain fundamentally altering Europe. Across the continent, the pressures are overwhelmingly environmental, but the fallout is deeply political and economic. The human toll is staggering. Official data out of Germany confirms 14,000 heat-related deaths during this summer's blistering heat waves. Just taking a moment to process that number, 14,000 casualties from weather in a highly developed nation is a catastrophe.
It is, and it shatters the previous record set in 2018. Europe is the world's fastest warming continent, and it is structurally entirely unequipped for these temperatures. The older architectural infrastructure and a widespread lack of residential air conditioning turned extreme heat into a mass casualty event, particularly for those over the age of 75. Public health authorities continually note that severe heat usually exacerbates pre-existing cardiovascular and respiratory conditions, making the actual death toll likely much higher than the official conservative estimate.
And the infrastructure crisis extends far beyond just keeping buildings cool. France is dealing with a severe water crisis that sounds almost dystopian. In towns like Saint-Marie-aux-Mines, traditional mountain springs have completely run dry. The municipality is surviving solely because huge silver tanker trucks are acting as pipelines on wheels, ferrying drinking water in from neighboring areas twice a week. And this drought is compounded by massive infrastructure failure. Rural French supply networks lose up to 21% of their water simply due to leaking, dilapidated pipes before it ever reaches a faucet.
And the economic cascades resulting from these environmental failures are paralyzing major European industries. In Germany, the Rhine River has dropped to record low levels, physically grounding commercial shipping barges. Steel giant ThyssenKrupp is desperately scrambling to secure coal via rail networks just to keep their furnaces running. The agricultural sector has lost 3 million metric tons of grain, wiping out roughly 600 million euros in revenue. Porsche is halting production of its electric Taycan model by 2030 at its Stuttgart plant, reflecting broader economic sluggishness and supply constraints. Furthermore, the dry conditions have sparked massive peat fires in the wetlands near the Belgian border.
Wait, how exactly does a fire burn in a wetland? Peat is essentially underwater soil, isn't it? How does a fire sustain itself underground?
So, peat is comprised of partially decayed organic matter that builds up in wetlands over thousands of years. Normally, it is waterlogged, but when severe drought dries it out, it becomes highly combustible fuel. These fires don't typically burn with a massive open flame. Instead, they smolder underground, starved of oxygen, burning at low temperatures for weeks or even months. They are incredibly difficult to extinguish with water from the surface. As they smolder, they release hazardous heavy metals and centuries of stored carbon directly into the atmosphere, which creates a devastating feedback loop that accelerates the very climate change causing the droughts.
And we are seeing this intense societal and economic stress immediately exploited for political gain. In Germany, the far-right Alternative for Germany, or AfD, is capitalizing heavily on public anxiety. Björn Höcke, the AfD leader in the eastern state of Thuringia, has just offered to back the left-wing populist Sarah Wagenknecht in a bid for the state premiership.
This is a highly calculated strategic maneuver. It goes far beyond strange bedfellows uniting over shared grievances regarding the economy. Hucke's offer is a deliberate attempt to break the firewall, that long-standing, strict consensus among mainstream German parties to absolutely never cooperate with the far right. By offering the votes of his parliamentary group to a left-wing candidate, he is attempting to normalize the AfD's legislative power. The goal is to collapse the institutional boundaries that have successfully kept far-right factions out of official governance since the end of World War II.
From the erosion of democratic norms and boundaries inside Europe, we move to the overt physical assault on a European democracy. Overnight, Russia launched massive ballistic missile and drone strikes on the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv.
Yeah, these strikes on August 20 resulted in at least 16 deaths and over 40 injuries. The Russian military utilized a complex combination of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. The explicit tactical goal was to intentionally exhaust Ukraine's critical shortage of air defense interceptors. The strikes heavily damaged civilian gas infrastructure and completely destroyed the upper floors of a 9-story residential block in the Solomiansky district of the capital.
And this violence is refusing to stay contained within Ukraine's borders. The strikes prompted both Poland and Romania to scramble fighter jets to protect their own airspace. The Romanian Defense Ministry reported a drone crashing into its territory, while Moldova also confirmed a drone crossing into its sovereign airspace, highlighting how quickly this conflict threatens to spill over into neighboring nations.
Right. And, the stories we're tracking as of August 20, 2026 reveal profound, simultaneous tests of accountability and systemic resilience moving in several distinct directions. We see this in the IDF, conducting internal investigations into its own troops in Gaza amid widespread skepticism regarding the mechanisms of international law. We see U.S. executives utilizing obscure legal loopholes and wartime statutes to bypass state and international regulations. And across Europe, we're watching aging physical infrastructure buckle under climate extremes, creating the exact societal friction that allows long-standing political firewalls to crack.
If $95 per vote is the new price tag just to defeat a candidate at the local primary level, what does the future of democratic representation look like when the basic cost of entry requires compromising the very policies the public is voting for? For listeners looking for slower historical context on how these geopolitical shifts and institutional vulnerabilities originated, be sure to check out our Brain Candy Explainers. You can find those, along with more daily world briefs and classic audiobooks, by visiting clarinhoratio.com.